In this video, we will discuss the persistent effect of geographical remoteness on world building. By remoteness, I'm talking about how isolated or distant a location is from major centers of activity, power, or civilization. In world building, remoteness can be created using natural barriers like mountains, oceans, and deserts, or through social factors like fragmented governments or limited communication. It's all about how far a place feels from the main areas of influence within your fictional world. Geography, with its fixed mountains and wide oceans, creates distance, not just in miles, but in minds, in the ways that people think about themselves and their relationship to power. The further a people are from the center of authority, the more they come to see themselves as their own masters. The story of human independence, rebellion, and defiance has often been written not just by leaders and revolutionaries, but by the landscape itself. Remoteness is a distance that can't be measured only in maps or miles. It's a matter of how far away a place feels, how distant it is from the hand that would rule it. The Romans learned this lesson well, centuries before any modern state felt the strain of distant colonies. In the far reaches of Britain, the Roman consul often acted with a freedom that would have been unthinkable in places like Gaul. The forest, the rivers, the channel, these were not just obstacles, they were shields keeping the consul beyond the immediate reach of Rome. Orders from the Senate would take long times to arrive, and by the time they did, the situation had often changed. It was simpler to make decisions on the ground, to act as though he himself were a small Rome, rather than waiting on the slow moving thoughts of distant rulers. Centuries later, that same remoteness shaped a different kind of independence in Britain, this time in matters of faith. When the Roman Catholic Church sought to enforce its authority over English bishops and kings, it found the sea as much a barrier as the dogged stubbornness of English lords. The authority of the Pope, so unquestioned in the heart of Europe, sometimes, faltered as it crossed the Channel. The Bishop of England, the bishops of England found that they could interpret doctrine with a freer hand, that they could bend the rules a little to suit their own needs. The Church in England grew a mind of its own, an independence that would only deepen as the centuries passed, transforming into a break that would change European religion. Once again, it was distance that softened the grip of authority, that allowed ideas and traditions to take root far from their original soil. But remoteness was not a force that faded with the fall of Rome or the rise of new kingdoms. When the English themselves planted colonies across the Atlantic, they soon found that distance had the same effect on their own claims to power. The 13 colonies, far from the shores of Britain, began to see themselves as something different, something separate. Orders and laws from London were met with skepticism, then resistance, and finally open rebellion. It wasn't just the taxes or the laws that sparked the American Revolution, it was the very fact of distance. The sense that the colonies were their own place, with their own needs and their own ways of doing things. The Atlantic Ocean had become a moat, a deep trench that separated the colonies from the mother country, not only in space, but in spirit. That was the power of remoteness, the way it whispered to those on the far edges that they could be their own masters. And even after the colonies broke free, that same spirit continued to shape the young republic. The settlers who crossed the Allegheny Mountains, who pushed beyond the reach of eastern cities and into the wide lands of the West, brought with them a fiery independence. The mountains stood between them and the old centers of power. And as they looked across the vast plains, they felt no need to wait for decisions made in distant halls of government. They dealt with the tribes as they saw fit, made treaties on their own terms, parceled out land with little regard for any authority beyond their own. The mountains, the rivers, the forests, they were like walls, but they didn't hold back the settlers. Instead, they held back the reach of government, leaving those who ventured beyond to fend for themselves. The settlers who moved westward saw the government as something far away, something that didn't understand the hardships of frontier life, the dangers and the opportunities that lay just beyond the next ridge. And when tensions rose between the states, when this union seemed ready to splinter, many of those frontier communities looked elsewhere, north to the British or south to the Spanish, considering new alliances, more close alliances that would serve their needs better than a distant capital. It was the same story repeated over centuries and across continents. The long arm of authority weakens as it stretches over land and water. The Romans learned it in Britain, The British learned it in America, and the American government would learn it again and again as settlers pushed ever westward. The landscape remained a stubborn obstacle, a barrier that couldn't easily be bridged by letters or orders. Again, distance breeds independence, and independence breeds defiance. It is a pattern as old as history, a thread that runs through the stories of empires and nations. When people live far away from the center of power, they begin to see themselves as the masters of their own fate. They grow impatient with commands that come across mountains or oceans, commands that seem ignorant of the realities they face every day. And so they act on their own, whether it's a Roman consul in the windswept north, a colonial merchant on the bustling docks of Boston, or a settler riding out onto the open plains.